Good morning, by the way. Um, so there's this story at the beginning of John. It's towards the beginning of John's gospel. I think it's kind of a fun story. And it says that John the Baptist actually he's out walking with his disciples. And as they're out doing their thing, they see Jesus go by. And John the Baptist points him out, and he says, like, that guy, right? That guy is the real deal. In fact, he says, I think something like, behold the Lamb of God. And as he says that, this is what I think is funny. Two of his disciples are like, wait, what? Why aren't we following that guy? So they get up and they leave John, and they say, well, if he says that guy's the big deal, let's go chase after him. And so then they go and they run after Jesus. And I like that story because it's different than we find in any of the other Gospels. We have these four Gospels, and they all tell a lot of the same stories, but in slightly different ways. And the other Gospels all talk about Jesus calling his disciples in a way where Jesus goes after them and calls them. But John's Gospel, at least for these two, mentions it in a way where it's almost like the disciples discover Jesus. Like Jesus was kind of incognito, but they happen to recognize him as they go by, and so then they chase after him, which sounds weird, but it's really the whole point of John's gospel. John himself says that his gospel is written so that you would believe, so that you would recognize that Jesus isn't just a man, but that he's God. In fact, at the very beginning of his gospel, there's a poem written there in which John says, Jesus being the light came into the world, but the world didn't recognize him. So we have this whole gospel that's really about teaching us to recognize God. So then it makes more sense that these first disciples would follow Jesus because they recognized something. And so they chase after Jesus, and then this exchange happens, this conversation when they get there. And it's particular. I'm going to call out a few things in it. They get to Jesus, and Jesus turns to him, and he asks first, what do you seek? And second, they say, Rabbi, which means teacher. And then they ask him, where are you staying? Right? Where are you gonna rest? And then after a brief conversation with Jesus, then they run off, and Andrew, one of the disciples, goes to find his brother and tells him, I have found the Messiah. So we have these four things, right? What are you seeking? Rabbi, where are you going to rest? And finally, I've found the Messiah. And I point those four things out because if we fast forward all the way then to the end of the Gospel of John, we have another story that's so shockingly similar that it has to be intentional. Once again, we have two disciples that go to find Jesus. But now they're running to the tomb because they've heard that Jesus, their rabbi who they buried there, isn't there anymore. So they race to the tomb to try to find him, and they look around, they can't find him anywhere, so discouraged, they leave. But Mary of Magdala stays because she was there with them, and so she stays, she's grieving, and in that time of being there, Jesus shows up to her, but she doesn't recognize him. You see how it's carrying this theme of John of how do we recognize God? So she doesn't recognize him. It says that she thinks he's the gardener, and then they have a conversation that hits on all four of these same things that happened at the very beginning of John. Jesus comes up to her and he says, first, why are you weeping? And then he says, what are you seeking? And then she says, well, I'm looking for Jesus. He was here, but you've taken him. Where is he resting? Then Jesus says her name, Mary, and she recognizes him and says, Rabbi, which means teacher. And then after a brief conversation, she runs back to the disciples and tells them, I have seen the Lord. It hits all four of these spots. And when that happens in Scripture especially, there's a literary device, a writing device that gets used a lot. John uses it constantly throughout his gospel, where something earlier gets mirrored later. It's a way of repeating really similar stories. But when they do that, this writing process, really the key to it, the big point is right in the middle. So when you find these mirrored things, what they're building towards is right in the center. So this first story was in John 1, the second one's in John 20, and then right in the middle in our chapter of John 10, we have a story with Jesus talking about how he is the good shepherd. Hopefully this verse comes up, but part of that speech, he says, I'm the good shepherd, and that the sheep, what does it say? The sheep know my voice, and the shepherd calls them by name. They hear my voice, I call my sheep by name. Which all take that, and it all comes back to this story at the end. Why does Mary suddenly recognize Jesus? This guy that she's talking to, that she thinks is the gardener the whole time, suddenly she recognizes him because he says, Mary. She hears his voice. He uses her name. And all of this story, it's like John's trying to say that to really know God, to really recognize God, we need to hear his voice speaking our name. Right? Simple as that, right? As easy as that is. There's really two ways that we learn things. One is by experience, right? I've been to the ocean, so I know what the ocean is. I've seen it, I've felt it, I've smelled the ocean air. I know it because I've experienced it. The second way that we learn things, if we haven't experienced them, is by relating them to things that we have experienced. So maybe I've never been to the ocean, but if I've been to a lake, it's like that, but much, much bigger, right? And it has waves in it, kind of like when a boat goes by on the Columbia and you get the wake, right? We compare it to things that we do know so that we can at least learn something that we haven't experienced. And most of the ways that we use to learn about God, reading the Bible, listening to sermons, listening to testimonies, reading books, all of these different things about God are really taking other people's experiences and doing our best to try to relate them to our own. And those are good things. But if what I think John is proposing here is right, to really know God, we can't just take other people's experiences. We need to hear God ourselves. We need to hear his voice. There's a story that I really want to dive more into today, which is in 1 Kings, and I referenced this last week. I mentioned that there's this story in the Old Testament in 1 Kings with Elijah the prophet, and he gets in a duel with other prophets, right? There's this big challenge of, okay, well, whose God is the real God? And when it starts off, Elijah sets up this premise of, okay, we'll both pray to our gods, and the God who answers by fire, that's the real God. And so all day these other prophets are calling to their God. They're shouting, they're yelling, they're dancing. It says they're even cutting themselves. They're doing whatever they can. But their God doesn't answer. And that's when Elijah mocks them, as I mentioned last week. But towards the end of the day, Elijah sets up his altar. And he digs a trench around it. And they cover it with water, so much so that it even fills up this trench surrounding it. And then with a simple prayer, God answers by fire, and it comes down and it devours the altar. It evaporates all the water there. It's a really big moment. And afterwards, all the other prophets try to flee, but they get captured and they get killed. So it seems like this really victorious moment for Elijah. But I want to pick up right after that story because I think it takes a really interesting turn. So here in 1 Kings 19, it says this. Ahab, who's the king of Israel at that time, told Jezebel, his wife, the queen, all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying this, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." That's a pretty overt threat from the queen. Then he was afraid, no kidding. And he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. So now he goes on by himself, and he went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It's enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my fathers." And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. That is also Mount Sinai, so the mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now that's a word of the Lord, by the way. You will notice voice comes next. And Elijah said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away." And the word said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be the king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place." This is such a strange story because Elijah was just at this huge moment, right, where God answered by prayer. It's a really big, overt display of power, and it feels like this is a really triumphant moment. But he goes from that to this frantic flight for his life. I think a part of what's going on here is that Elijah's going through a transition. Last week I talked about prayer in general, and this next coming weeks we're going to continue working on this idea of prayer and what does that mean. But I want to point out at the beginning here that there's a difference between prayer where we speak, prayer where I'm asking for things, where I'm opening up things and confessing and thanking and praising and all this stuff, where I'm kind of pouring things out, a very active prayer. But if what John suggested about really knowing God is right, then there's also this element where we need to hear God's voice. And I think that this drastic change happens in Elijah because he's in a moment where he's doing big things, faithful things, and it's going well. But what he needs now is not to be doing. What he needs here is to hear God. And that's a really, really difficult process. And today I want to talk about a kind of prayer that we call contemplative prayer, or silent prayer or listening prayer. And honestly, I wish that my wife were teaching it. I wish that she was the one up here talking about it because she gets it better than I do. She honestly knows so much more in this area. She's experienced so much more in this area. Today, what I hope to do is maybe share some stories about kind of the process for me in trying to figure out this kind of prayer where we hear God's voice instead of our own. I hope to share some stories, maybe point out a few things that I've learned to kind of, I guess, let you into that journey as well. Honestly, about 8 years ago, prayer changed a lot for me. There are things that used to work. Prayer used to be a pretty common and pretty easy thing for me. And it wasn't like my faith changed. I've continued to follow God faithfully. I've continued to be obedient, to live a life of holiness. Like, I don't think those things have changed, but the way that I pray, the way I used to do it became really difficult. Because I think, like Elijah, I needed to be able to hear God. I needed to be able to move from just saying things to let God speak into things, because there were some hurdles that have come up in the way that I think about God, some hurdles that came up in the way that I think about prayer, and all these things in the way that we think. The more we think about them, the more we tend to kind of get in that same rut. There's a quote, actually, that's attributed to Albert Einstein, where he says, "We cannot solve problems using the same way of thinking that we used when we created them." Right? That there's a pattern of thought that we get into, and a lot of times prayer and the way that we critique our relationship with God, we go through the same patterns just hoping maybe I can think my way out of it. But there's something that needs to happen where we hear God's voice and we allow him to transform us. We allow him to change things in us and change the way that we think about things that are different than the way we would have done it on our own. So in the story with Elijah, obviously I think the most fascinating part is at the very end, where he gets to Mount Horeb and this word of God comes to him and tells him, "Go out because the Lord's coming by." And we have this huge wind that comes through, and it just tears up the mountains, tears up the rocks, makes everything shake. But then it says, God's not in that. And then there's an earthquake. Once again, God's not in that. And then there's a fire, and it's like, Elijah, get out of there. This is not a good situation for you. But again, God's not in that. And then we get this whisper. And what I think is most fascinating about that, more even than where God is found, is that the writer here goes through so much effort to try to tell us where God isn't found. All of these things that traditionally in Scripture are associated with the presence of God. Wind, fire. In fact, the story right before, Elijah himself said, okay, the God who's real will answer by fire. But all these things that traditionally we associate with God, they're big things, they're loud things, they're really obvious things, and he's pointing out God's not in them. Where do you turn when you feel like, I need to encounter God? I want to meet with God, I want to see God, I want to hear from God, I want to have this experience. Where do you turn? Because if you're like me, what I usually do is I start downloading podcasts, right? Who are the pastors that I like to follow? Who are the teachers that I like to hear from? Let me listen to some of their things. Or maybe I turn on worship music. I want to feel some things. How do I just get into that experience? Or we look for retreats or conferences, and all these things, they're good. They're good things. But I think part of what this story is pointing out is that God can use those things, but God's not in those things. And again, I'm not saying that those aren't inspired. I'm not saying that God doesn't use those. But those all feel like shortcuts of, okay, I want to hear from God, so let me just fill my head with other people talking about him or other people singing about him, right? So I can think these things or I can feel these things quickly, or I can have this experience at a retreat, at a conference, at something where I get to jump right into this. But where Elijah finds that voice isn't in those big things. It's in a silence, in a whisper, in something quiet and really, really uncomfortable. Last week, Chris and I were joking about, so where am I going to go this week when I talk about contemplative prayer? And I made the joke, well, if we're going to be talking about praying in silence, I thought we would just open up and say, hey, let's all just be silent for half an hour. Ready, go. And he joked, yeah, you could do that, but everyone would probably just leave, right? You're not contained. You can just, well, I'm going to go do something else, which makes sense because silence feels like a waste of time. It feels empty. It feels absent. And so to sit and do nothing, which really is the whole process of contemplative prayer, to sit, to listen, to do nothing. When my mind wanders to other things and I want to start thinking about, oh, well, this is the stuff that I need to do here. These are the things that I forgot to tell my wife about, or these are the things that I need to get done today, or da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, to rein it back in and try to be still and silent. It feels like a waste. And this story about Elijah, I think, challenges that idea that what feels empty and feels pointless, I think he's arguing that really that is the thing where we start to hear God. Probably about 2 years ago, my wife was reading some more stuff on contemplative prayer, and as we would talk about it more, we finally just decided, I think what we need to do is try it. We need to get a group of people together and we need to just try this thing. So we called up a handful of close friends that seemed to be kind of in the same place and said, you want to come by our house on Thursday mornings? And so for months at 6 a.m., people would file into our house and they would all kind of march in like monks because we knew that the idea was to be quiet. So we'd kind of just come in and nod at each other and then just go and sit in different parts of our living room. And for an hour, we would just be quiet. And we would just try to listen and see, okay, we're going to find out if God shows up. And after an hour, when it was time to go to work, people would silently get up and go. And I don't know what other people got out of that. But the next Thursday, back they would come and we would sit. And for me, it took a couple months into it before God showed me something really uncomfortable. I remember sitting there and trying to still my mind and trying to be quiet and try not to get distracted by all these other things. And you'd find yourself looking around the room. And oftentimes you would make eye contact with someone else who was also kind of looking around the room, and it was jarring for a moment, right? It's shocking to look at someone in the eyes and suddenly we would both divert and look the other way of like, oh, that's really interesting over there. And yeah, this was a couple months into this. I remember that happening and me diverting eye contact from someone else, and I felt this nudge that said, yeah, you do that with me too. As if God was pointing out that inability to connect, that inability to look someone right in the eyes. I do that with God too. There's a Valentine's Day card that I got a long time ago from an old girlfriend. Sorry, Jennifer. We aren't in contact anymore. But she sent me this Valentine's Day card that it just looked like a big eyeball. Happy Valentine's Day. And when you open the card, on the inside it says, "This is why people don't kiss with their eyes open." Valid. Yep, that's a good point. There's something really, really uncomfortable about looking someone right in the eyes. It just feels vulnerable. And I realized that's why I want to think about so many things when I pray. That's why I want to always go on these routes of like, if I can just keep talking about things, or if I can just keep thinking of things to share or say or think about, then it's like I can keep turning away from just looking at God. And at that point, I kind of adopted this phrase that I would try to repeat whenever I was trying to pray in silence. Whenever I felt myself getting distracted or kind of pulled into these different things or trying to change the subject, I would say, "God, I see you, and you see me." And I'm not saying there's anything magic about that, but I knew that I needed something to kind of keep bringing me back to stop trying to do other things. Stop trying to divert away from whatever God's trying to do here. Bring the focus back. God, I see you, and you see me. And a lot of other people, as we've read on this, adopt things like, "God, I'm here, I'm listening." Whatever it is that helps bring you back into that space, it helps. I think part of the reason, too, that we really struggle to have that eye contact with God is that we're so used to projecting. We're so used to trying to be the person that we want to be that it's really uncomfortable to just let God see us. Like the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve hide from God because suddenly they're ashamed of everything that they are. It's like I try so hard in every avenue of my life, with my friends, with my family, with work, to try to project the person that I want to be, that it's really difficult to just let God see, yeah, all right, this is me. I had mentioned that about 8 years ago, prayer changed for me. And part of the reason is that at that time, my wife and I were going through some really big, I would say, traumatic experiences. There's some really difficult stuff that happened with the church that we were in. There's some really difficult stuff that happened with some friends of ours. And the whole thing was just such a traumatic experience that, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I took it really personally. And there's a lot of stuff that I'm still kind of having to process through and all of that. But when we were in the midst of that, we went on this vacation. We do this every summer. We go to Cannon Beach and we go to a retreat there, which is phenomenal. If you get a chance, yeah, I definitely recommend it, because you go to the Oregon coast, and for a week, they feed you a ridiculous amount of food. You get up in the morning, you have breakfast, they have a chapel service, and then you have a huge chunk of free time until the end of the day when they feed you dinner, and then there's another chapel service, and then again, you can do whatever you want. And I remember that year, there was so much going on in our lives that we would get up in the morning, we'd go to breakfast, go to chapel, and then during free time, we would go back to our room and crash. We would just fall asleep. We would sleep until dinner, get up, go to dinner, chapel, go back to sleep. For like 3 days, all we did with our free time was just sleep. Because we were exhausted. There was so much stress. There was so much turmoil going on. Like, that was the best you could get out of it. And I love that in this story, as Elijah runs away and he's in a panic, he gets by himself, he gets under this broom tree, and he just falls asleep. And after a while, God wakes him up, and he's like, hey, Elijah, have some cake. All right, now go back to sleep. A little bit later, wakes him up, hey, Elijah, have some more cake. Right? This may be kind of an aside, but I want to point out that if you try this, when you try to just get silent and spend time with God, you're very, very likely to find that you're just going to want to go to sleep. Because I think a part of our culture right now is that we are so busy, even in the midst of this COVID thing, we are so busy, we are so active that the only times we actually slow down are when we sleep. And you're going to find that trying to sit still and do nothing, your body is going to want to crash because it needs that. And so you may need to just nap and eat until your body is at a restful spot where it can be present. So that's what we did that year. But then if you fast forward about 6 years, we go to this retreat every year. This was probably actually last year when we were there. And we've been practicing this contemplative prayer more. It's something that I've been trying to figure out, trying to implement a bit more in my life. I remember about halfway through the retreat, I got up early in the morning and I just went out to walk the streets of Cannon Beach. Everything's closed, no one's around. It's a great way to just be quiet. And for me, walking really kind of helps still my mind a little bit. And so I went out to just go walk around in silence and be in the presence of God. But it was like something opened inside of me. It was this walk that was supposed to be really quiet and contemplative turned into suddenly me ranting because all this anger and frustration started coming out. Stuff that I honestly wasn't totally aware was in there. I'm angry at people, I'm angry at situations, but mostly I'm angry with God. And I start talking about all these things that I'm frustrated with, all these things that I was trusting him to do, but it didn't seem like he did. These ways that I felt let down, these ways that I felt abandoned, that I was just so frustrated with God about. It was like it all just spilled out. The author Ruth Haley Barton talks about contemplative prayer and silence, and she compares our souls in this to like a jar of river water. This water that has all this dirt and sediment and stuff in it. And she says that oftentimes we try to get clarity, we try to calm things down by like pushing down all the dirt in there. Oh man, if I could just get this out of the way. But the more that we actively try to clear the water, the more it really just muddies it. But that there's something about silence, about rest, that acts like spiritual gravity, and this stuff slowly begins to settle if you give it enough time, if you do it enough times. And it was like, for me, it took years to do that, but my ego finally got to step aside just enough that this stuff that I didn't want to admit, the stuff that I didn't know was in there, just started coming out. In the story with Elijah, it's mentioned briefly, so it's really easy to miss. But he doesn't just show up at the mountain where God speaks to him. It says it takes him 40 days and 40 nights to get there. And there's certain numbers that we see that happen a lot, especially in the Old Testament when we're reading the Bible. We see lots of 7s and 3s and 4s and lots of 40s. And the reason we see that is because for ancient Middle Eastern cultures, numbers aren't really about quantity. It's not really about how many are there. It's about a quality, a value that number represents. So we see 7 and we think, oh, well, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these things. But really, they use the number 7 because they're trying to express a value or a quality. And 40 is a number that represents humility. Noah gets on the ark and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. And by the end of this, Noah's like, I get it. I'm little. You're big. Gotcha. The Israelites escape from Egypt and they can't get into the promised land. And so they have to then wander the desert for 40 years. While a whole generation passes before they have the humility then to trust in God. Likewise, Jesus, right after he's baptized, he goes into the desert to be tempted for 40 days and 40 nights. Maybe it's exactly 40, but really 40 days means whatever amount of time that it takes to find humility. And for me, that took years of doing this before it started to settle enough that the stuff that I was trying to keep hidden could come out. And by the way, after that, after 20 minutes of just ranting at God and telling him all the things that he's done wrong and all the things that I'm really frustrated, you know what he said to me? Nothing. It was silent. It was silent, but it wasn't like a judgmental silence. It wasn't like an empty silence. It was, I don't know how to describe it other than like a full silence. In fact, in me, I really wanted to move on. I wanted to immediately start talking about, oh, but God, these are all the things that I know that you do. These are all the reasons you're good. These are all the reasons that I trust you and I follow you and I worship you. And I wanted to go there, but it was almost like the silence was like, wait. Just be here. It was like I had permission to feel that way. Like maybe God's big enough to handle me being mad at him. And we didn't have to move on. We didn't have to go somewhere else. Of like, just be here. Just be present in this. I find that I think too much about things. I try too much to process my own way through things to try to understand it, which is what makes being quiet really hard. A couple months ago, I was out walking with a friend, and we were talking about this idea of prayer and being silent and how it's so hard to just be in that moment because I immediately want to jump to all these things that I feel like I'm supposed to say or I'm supposed to do. And my friend asked me, he says, so when do you feel most present? When do you feel like you're here now? And I said, one's in music. When I'm doing music, that feels a lot of times like I'm just here. And the other time is there's some conversations that I get into with people that I really trust, people that I really value being around, that you're in the moment. And I'm not thinking about the next thing that I want to say. I'm not thinking about trying to make a point. There's times when I'm worshiping where I'm not trying to think about, okay, what chord comes next, or how do I make the song do this? What are we building to? I'm not even worried about those things. In fact, those moments, I told him, they feel fragile. They feel like if I'm not careful and I try to make something happen here, if I try to think about, okay, what do I want to do, or how do I make this keep going, like I could break it. That the best thing I can do to stay in this moment is to just kind of back up and be there. Participate, but stop trying to drive things. Stop trying to make things happen. Stop analyzing and evaluating how this is going. At the very end of this whole journey that Elijah goes through, Do you notice that even after he hears God's voice, he says the exact same thing? The same thing that he said when he was in the cave before God was like, okay, come on out. Let me speak. He then says the exact same thing again. And that feels to me like a failure. That feels like, okay, there's clearly something Elijah didn't get because there's zero progress between point A and point B, and I think that's kind of the point. One of the biggest struggles with this idea of being still and being silent is that we have such an idea of what needs to happen for it to be valuable. We have such a strong idea of what progress looks like, what productivity looks like, what's valuable, that we're always evaluating it. We're always trying to turn it into something that'll redeem the time, and we need to take those things and we need to set them aside. And I'm just going to be where I am. And I'm just going to let God do what God does. And whether that feels productive or not, I'm going to be here and I'm going to trust and I'm going to let these things settle. Because at the end of the day, right, if we come back to John's story, when Jesus asks, what do you seek? All of them, what they were really seeking was God. What we seek is God. And where we're going to find that voice is in the silence. So may you find times to get away. Find times to be silent, and if that's resting, if that's sleeping, if that's what we need, build that so that we can be present without bringing our agendas. May we find times to have that eye contact. May everything in us begin to settle enough that we can be humble, that we can hear the voice of God call our name. Amen. Sorry, I should have given you